IB Environmental students. Today we're going to be talking about food resources and a lot of interesting stuff in this topic 3.5. Let's begin. Unfortunately, across the globe, food resources are unequally distributed. A lot of that is because food production systems are different in different portions of the planet. Some reasons for this might be because of governmental policies. Others are because of climatic factors such as light, soil, temperature, and other limiting factors you guys know in depth. And those things are going to all influence what is going to be able to grow and what is wanted to be grown. And all those things can be summed into these sort of factors. What is the amount and type of land available? How much labor is the location able to put into that land? How much capital or resources are available? And what kind of energy sources, specifically fossil fuels, is the location going to be able to put into this? All these are going to differ in different amounts of development or in different demographics, which leads to these unequal food resources distribution. You can see here on this map that unfortunately a lot of the food is going to mostly be available in industrialized agriculture. These systems we'll see in a second are much more intense than other sorts of systems that are more of this kind of orangey yellow color. Here are our different types of systems we're going to look at in more depth. The first type of system is this one, which is used by mostly developed countries, MEDCs, because it's very industrialized. Notice that it's got a lot of land use. Not too much labor is involved because, see, this man is on this tractor. We need a lot of resources or capital, nature being used, and also a lot of fossil fuels are going into the fact that this guy is going to be plowing this area. The other one is this intensive traditional agricultural method, mostly in an LEDC location. Not as much land is going to be used. Sometimes this might even be the local community rather than this giant vast of farm. But notice that these people are very much themselves doing the rice planting here in this picture. That's going to take a lot of labor, but because they're doing it themselves, they don't end up needing that much fossil fuel energy. The natural capital, though, itself is not being used up very quickly, because this method is a bit more sustainable at times. Two other methods that sometimes we forget about. These are both used by LEDCs. This one's called shifting cultivation. Usually occurs in tropical rainforests or just tropical forests in general. Notice that this is going to use a lot of land. They are cutting down lots of timber. They would maybe leave this area alone and maybe it would grow back. It uses a lot of capital and but not too much labor is going into this. We don't really focus on this one too much. Another one is nomadic herding. Notice that this depends heavily on the land available, and it's going to take a lot of space. These people are going to move around to different locations as they use some of that land and the grass, and they keep moving. These are not as common in our developed world because we mostly rely on intensive, very fossil fuel-based agriculture. But I want you to think about what the impact of this is and how it relates to food supply. You and I both know that a lot of people, not everybody, really like to get a lot of protein, and it's very high in calories, which is really useful, but it also helps us build our muscles, our structure, and do our daily lives. And because of that, a lot of people really enjoy a lot of these sorts of different meat types. Especially beef, is people will be super happy if they had a steak. I don't know, I'm not. But it's important to understand that we have enough food in this planet to feed the entire world population this amount of calories a day, but unfortunately only a fourth of the planet consumes 3/4 of the food. So in a lot of places, these things are too expensive and they are left with just vegetable content, which is yummy and nutritious in some ways, but it doesn't hold a lot of protein content. And because of that, we can see the distribution of hunger, which is really interestingly visualized on this figure by blowing up the size of the locations who are most hungry. And you can see that the Western world is very tiny here, suggesting that there's very few compared to this area of the planet of hungry people. Specifically children in this case. And this is going to be drastically related to infant mortality, drastically related to birth rates and death rates, and total fertility rates. We can make tons of connections to stuff we've already been talking about. So demographics and food supply, highly related. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I want you to notice how much calories the MEDCs, such as places like the US, are getting per person. Wow, way more than we need, which is a little around 2,000 plus or minus, depending on our activity level. And look at this area of the world, Eritrea, 15. Definitely not enough, and this is average. So there's some people getting this, and there's people drastically getting below. Anything under 1,200 is considered starvation mode. We were mostly focusing on this figure here, but you're welcome to read these other things which are interesting. So what's influencing these factors? Well, there's a lot of social political things involved, and we can think of this as a social political feedback loop that's positive because it's self-maintaining and it's not going to ever bring back to equilibrium or equal amounts of these food resources, unfortunately. Continually and sadly, it'll make the poor more hungry and more poor and more hungry. So this could look like the government is unfortunately focused on exporting its goods, such as bananas, in places like Costa Rica rather than feeding their own people. And then the MEDCs who are importing those goods are going to subsidize the fossil fuels that are helping that to be pretty cheap as a process to export. Then the MEDCs are lucky enough to have the technology to do really strong, intensive agriculture with higher outputs. This is called the green revolution. We'll talk about that more in a second. And then unfortunately, the LADCs have less human resources, less produced assets, and less natural capital because their overall well-being is much less, their standard of living. And it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy where they're able to do less growing of the food, less buying of the food. Very unfortunate. So very positive feedback loop. But notice that this technology piece is key to relating to industrialization and demographic transition. We see over here in the West, in Europe, the first green revolution, which was when technology allowed for a high output of food production. We'll see in the greener color these areas that began a second wave of this technology, high output, high fossil fuel content growing of crops. And this green revolution is referring to this efficiency and changes of production. For instance, in the US, really early on, we started selectively breeding our crops in order to get breeds that had better desirable traits, getting things that had a particular color, things that had a bigger fruit itself, or maybe juicy or tartar or different things. We crossbreed things to get what we wanted. And it takes some time, but it's pretty fast. And then even more so, and we'll talk more about this in class, we start genetically modifying some organism. In thinking about genetically modified organisms, there's a lot of projected advantages and projected disadvantages. You don't need to write down every single one of these, but you might want to write down 2 or 3 on each side that really are stark and interesting to you that you might want to discuss in class. So for instance, genetically modified organisms need less fertilizer because they have genes that allow them to do so. They might need less water and be able to live in a droughter area. They might be resistant to insects, plant disease, frost, or drought. They probably are going to grow faster and bigger and maybe even deal with salty soils. Maybe they won't spoil as fast. Maybe they'll taste better. They might even be able to not have as much pesticides on them. They'll tolerate higher levels of herbicides that would normally kill the weeds nearby. All these things you do need to understand that they're really useful in growing more and more plants per square area of land. And there's only so much land left on the planet, so that's really important because we have a lot of hungry mouths to feed, we've talked about already in this podcast. There are some disadvantages that are up in the air, so we might have unpredictable genetic and ecological effects of these genetically modified organisms. They're new. We don't know what they're going to do in the long, long run. They might have some toxins in the food from some cell mutations. We don't know all the details of this. They're really complex, and sometimes the public isn't always informed. Sometimes things aren't always properly labeled. They might cause allergens. This is up to speculation. Some people really think this is true. Some people are not always sure. They might have lower nutrition content, as we're trying to get all these other things as more important potentially for growing the plants bigger, faster, stronger. We might also increase the resistance to pesticides within these plants for the insects and other diseases. So of these things, the insects and diseases, they might go through natural selection faster because we're giving them this environment that might cause them to change quicker over time to resist the pesticides and insecticides and other things we would normally put on them. We need to we're creating things that aren't even able to be killed by herbicide because of this sometimes. And what if they get escape into nature and we can't even stop them with anything because they're resistant? They might harm insects. There's speculation that maybe bees are having their colony collapse because of all these things we're putting out that are genetically modified. And we need bees. They're pollinators. They have a huge ecological value and service by pollinating our crops. And lastly, because we are corporatizing and also people own these genetically modified organisms as property, they're growing them more and more vastly, so it's lowering the genetic diversity, and we call those things, if they're the whole field of those plants, we call it a monoculture, a single plant culture on a farm, and that's very much a problem. Think potato famine. That didn't work out so well for the Irish. So what's the global trend in food production? It's increasing because we're using a lot more of these things involved in the green revolution, but who's really using them? Mostly more economically developed countries because they have the wealth to pay for those technologies. A lot of the less economically developed countries are really struggling to do these sorts of things because they can't really afford it. It's putting them in a worse situation, that positive feedback loop. But even so, we only have so much land we can do this on. A lot of our land is not even possibly a good place to put agricultural situations on. So ice, snow, desert, mountains, it's unlikely you're going to be able to grow corn. It's not like you're going to grow rice there, those big staples. And so there's only so much of the land that we can really use. That's this green part. And a lot of this other land we hope we won't touch, but people want to really cut those trees down and use it, but we have to think about this is our natural capital. We have ecological services and goods we're getting from this place right now. And same thing with this area. Both are potentially going to be changed over into cropland and grazing land. So next time we'll talk about what does this mean, cropland and grazing land, and how could we maybe compare different types of terrestrial and aquatic systems, their efficiency, and how they're working in different locations. Great job, and don't forget to watch that TED Talk about genetically modified organisms versus organic food by that awesome 11-year-old. See you guys in class. Bye.